Hey there, and welcome to True Scary Stories. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That helps YouTube know you love creepy stories and it'll keep sending more your way. Story 1: The Frozen Man. Working in Alaska's North Slope oil fields is tough work. The isolation gets to you after months of nothing but white snow and darkness. I had been doing pipeline maintenance near Prudhoe Bay for about 6 years when this happened in February 2018. The money was really good, which is why guys like me and my buddies Jake and Mike kept coming back every season. We looked out for each other through terrible storms and equipment problems that could kill you before help arrived. We had just finished fixing a section of pipe that cracked from the constant freezing and thawing. The company put us in a shelter about 40 miles south of Deadhorse, right off the Dalton Highway. The drive back should have been normal. We had done it many times before in Jake's heavy-duty Ford truck with chains on all the tires. Mike was sleeping in the back seat while I rode up front, keeping Jake company as he drove through a bad snowstorm. We could only see about 30 feet ahead. The headlights just bounced off the swirling snow, making it feel like we were flying through space. We were about 2 hours into the drive when Jake suddenly hit the brakes hard. Through the storm we could barely see a person stumbling along the side of the road. There was no car in sight and no emergency lights. Just this person in a heavy coat moving like someone who was freezing to death. Jake pulled over right away. You never leave anyone in weather like that when it's 40 below zero. Mike woke up cursing about the sudden stop but went quiet when he saw what we were looking at. The three of us sat there for maybe 5 seconds watching this guy struggle through knee-deep snow about 20 yards ahead. His coat was old military green with fur around the hood that kept whipping in the wind. What struck me as strange was how he walked. Not stumbling like someone fighting the cold, but moving like a robot following a path only he could see. Jake honked the horn twice, but the guy didn't turn his head. He just kept walking forward with his arms hanging at his sides. "He's going to die out there," Mike said, reaching for his door handle. Jake put the truck in park and we all got out. The wind hit us like 1,000 tiny knives. Even with our heavy gear, the cold tried to get through every gap. We jogged toward the guy calling out, but our voices got swallowed by the storm. When we got within 10 feet, Jake grabbed his shoulder to turn him around. That's when things got weird. The man's face was paper white, but not from frostbite. His eyes were cloudy gray like dirty ice and seemed to look right through us. He had about 3 days of stubble dark against that unnatural white skin. His lips were moving constantly, forming words we couldn't hear over the wind. But it was the scar that made Jake step back. A jagged line running from his left temple down to his jaw. The kind of mark that tells you someone survived something they shouldn't have. "Sir, are you okay?" Mike shouted, waving his hand in front of the man's face. No response. The guy just stood there swaying slightly. Those cloudy eyes fixed on something beyond us, beyond everything. His lips never stopped moving. When I leaned in closer I could just make out what he was repeating. 247,247,247. Over and over like a broken record. Jake and Mike looked at each other. We had all heard stories about people going crazy from isolation up here, but this was different. This felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. We had to get him in the truck though. Leaving him would mean explaining a frozen body to the police, and none of us needed that paperwork. It took all three of us to guide him to the truck. He didn't fight, but he didn't help either. Just let us move him like a mannequin. His body was stiff and cold even through the coat. The weird thing was he didn't shiver. You spend enough time in the Arctic, and you know that shivering is your body's last defense against cold. When that stops, you're in real trouble. But this guy's skin was ice cold, and he wasn't shivering at all. We got him in the back with Mike, who pressed himself against the far door like he was trying to disappear. Jake turned the heat to maximum and pulled back onto the road. For about 10 minutes nobody said anything. The only sounds were the heater on full blast, and those lips still moving, still forming those same numbers. Then Mike cleared his throat and said what we were all thinking. "Guys, doesn't he look like that missing snowmobiler from a couple years back? The one where they found the sled but never the body?" Jake's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. I remembered that story. Everyone who worked the slope did. February 2016, a local guy named Robert Chin went missing during a solo snowmobile trip. They found his sled wrapped around a tree about 15 miles from where we picked up our passenger. There was blood on the seat and drag marks leading into the woods that just stopped. Search teams looked for 2 weeks before giving up. In that kind of cold without shelter, you have maybe a few hours. They declared him dead and had a memorial service. His brother worked for one of the drilling companies and used to drink at the same bar in Deadhorse. He said Robert had that exact scar from a childhood accident with a boat propeller. The more I looked at our silent passenger in the rearview mirror, the more my stomach churned. Same scar, same face shape, even the same color eyes. Though Robert's had been brown in the photos, not this milky gray. The shelter appeared through the storm like a metal island with its yellow lights barely cutting through the wall of snow. We radioed ahead but got nothing but static, which wasn't unusual in weather like this. The building was one of those shipping containers the oil companies scatter along the pipeline route. It had bunks, a small kitchen, and communication equipment. Jake parked as close to the door as possible, and we prepared to move our passenger inside. That's when he spoke for the first time. His voice was scratchy and wrong, like someone talking underwater. "Can't go in." "Not yet. Not until 2:47. Mike actually jumped, banging his head on the door frame. But we weren't leaving anyone in the truck to freeze no matter what they wanted. It took Jake bear hugging him from behind while Mike and I each took an arm, but we got him through the door. The second we crossed the threshold, he went completely limp. Dead weight that nearly took us all to the floor. We laid him on one of the bottom bunks. Jake went to check the radio, while Mike put water on for coffee. I stayed with our guest, checking his pulse. It was slow but steady. Up close under the harsh lights, more details jumped out. His fingernails were way too long, curved and yellowish, like he hadn't cut them in months. There was no smell though, which bothered me more than it should have. Someone who had been wandering the wilderness should smell of sweat or body odor or something. But there was nothing. Just this neutral, almost sterile absence of scent. His coat pockets were empty except for one item that made my chest tighten. A snowmobile key on a leather fob, the kind they sold at the Deadhorse gas station. The leather was cracked and weathered, and branded into it was R. Chin 2015. Mike came back with the coffee and saw me holding the key. His face went pale, and he set the mugs down so hard coffee spilled everywhere. "That's not possible," he whispered, but we both knew it was right there in my hand. Jake came back from the radio room shaking his head. The storm was interfering with everything. We were stuck until it passed, probably another 8 to 10 hours. That's when the power flickered. Just once, but enough to make us all look up. These shelters had backup generators that kicked in automatically, so power issues were rare. The lights steadied, but something had changed in the room. Our passenger's eyes were open, staring directly at the clock on the wall. 11:30 p.m. His lips started moving again, faster this time. That same number. 2:47. Mike grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Right now, storm or no storm." But Jake was already shaking his head, pointing at the window where the snow was coming down so thick you couldn't see the truck parked 10 feet away. We were trapped, and somewhere deep in my brain I had the feeling that was exactly what was supposed to happen. The next few hours crawled by. We took turns watching our visitor while trying to act normal. Jake made sandwiches nobody ate. Mike cleaned his tools for the third time. I kept checking the weather outside, hoping for any sign the storm was ending. The man never moved from the bunk. He just lay there with his eyes locked on that clock, lips moving in their endless countdown. Around 2 a.m. exhaustion hit us hard. Mike volunteered for first watch while Jake and I grabbed bunks on the opposite side of the room. I didn't think I would sleep, but the crash knocked me out cold. I woke to Mike shaking me violently, his eyes wide with panic. The clock read 2:46 a.m. Jake was already up, standing by the door with a wrench in his hand. "He's gone," Mike gasped. I just looked away for a second to check the coffee pot, and when I turned back, the bunk was empty. We searched the shelter, all 40 feet of it, but there was nowhere to hide. The man had simply vanished. That's when we heard it. 3 deliberate knocks on the metal door. Slow and measured like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. 2:47 a.m. The knocking came again. This time from the window on the north wall, then the south window, then back to the door. It circled the shelter like something was walking around outside testing each entrance. Jake gripped the wrench tighter. "That's impossible," he said. "Nobody could survive out there without gear." But we all knew our visitor hadn't exactly been normal. The knocking stopped at 2:48, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt like pressure in our ears. We stayed frozen like that until dawn. Nobody willing to be the first to move. When the storm finally broke around 7 a.m., we made a discovery that sent us racing for the truck. There were no footprints anywhere around the shelter. Not leading away from the door, not under the windows. Nothing. The snow was perfect and untouched. But Mike never made it to the truck. When Jake and I turned around, he was just gone. No sound, no struggle, no tracks. Just empty air where he had been standing 2 seconds before. We tore out of there and didn't stop until we hit Fairbanks. We filed a missing person report and told them about picking up the stranger. We left out the part about him possibly being Robert Chin. The police found Mike's body 3 days later, 15 miles from the shelter, in the exact spot where Chen's snowmobile had crashed. Frozen solid with lips blue and drag marks in the snow that just stopped. Story 2. The Night Visitor at Mile 237. The nights at Mile 237 fuel stops stretched endlessly. Each one bleeding into the next until time lost all meaning. I had been there since early November, manning the counter while Arctic winds rattled the windows and big trucks rolled past like ghosts on the Dalton Highway. The job paid well enough for a college student trying to save money. The owner, Eugene, didn't ask too many questions when I needed extra shifts. Most nights passed without problems. Truckers grabbing coffee, locals filling up their tanks, maybe the occasional tourist who had gotten lost in a storm. The station wasn't much to look at. 2 pumps out front, a small store with overpriced snacks and a bathroom that barely worked when the pipes weren't frozen solid. Everything changed on my 3rd Wednesday there. The clock had just hit 2 a.m. when I noticed headlights cutting through the storm outside. An old blue Chevy pickup with rust eating through its paint pulled up to pump number 4 and just stopped. The driver didn't get out, didn't reach for his wallet, didn't even turn off the engine. He just sat there, visible only as a dark shape through the frost-covered windshield. After about 10 minutes I figured maybe he was having car trouble or had fallen asleep. But when I grabbed my jacket to go check on him, the truck suddenly reversed and disappeared back into the storm. Strange, sure, but in a place like that, strange was normal. I made a note in the log book and went back to restocking the energy drinks, figuring that would be the end of it. The following Wednesday arrived with another storm worse than the last one. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet, and the wind made the whole building creak like an old ship. Eugene had warned me about nights like these. He said sometimes the weather got so bad that even the truckers would wait it out rather than risk the highway. I was counting inventory in the back room, trying to stay busy, when I heard the familiar rumble of an engine outside. The clock on the wall showed exactly 2 a.m. Through the security monitor I watched that same blue Chevy pull up to pump 4. Same spot as before, and the driver did the exact same thing. Absolutely nothing. This time I got a better angle on the camera and could make out more details. The man wore what looked like a heavy winter coat with the hood up. His hands gripped the steering wheel at exactly 10 and 2. He never moved, never reached for the radio, never even seemed to breathe. I let it go on for 15 minutes before deciding to check on him. The moment I stepped toward the door, keys in hand, the truck's reverse lights came on. By the time I pushed through the wind and snow to reach pump 4, nothing remained but tire tracks already being erased by the storm. The whole thing left me unsettled in a way I couldn't explain. There was something mechanical about his movements, or lack of them. Like watching a video on repeat. I spent the rest of my shift jumping at every set of headlights that passed, but the blue Chevy didn't return. When Eugene came in for the morning shift, I mentioned it to him, trying to keep my tone casual. He just shrugged and said, "We get all kinds out here, especially during storm season." But I noticed he avoided making eye contact when he said it, and his fingers drummed nervously on the counter. By the third Wednesday I had prepared myself. I had even switched shifts with my coworker specifically to be there at 2 a.m., though I didn't tell her the real reason. The security system at the station was old, but it worked. I had figured out how to save clips to a USB drive, and I had one ready in my pocket. The storm that night was lighter, just steady snow instead of a full blizzard, which meant better visibility. I positioned myself behind the counter with a clear view of Pump 4, pretending to read a magazine while I waited. At 1:58 a.m. I heard it. That distinctive engine rumble growing louder as it approached from the north. The blue Chevy appeared from the darkness like it had been summoned, pulling into the exact same spot with perfect precision. This time I was ready, with the camera controls zooming in as close as the old system would allow. What I saw made my skin crawl. The man in the driver's seat wasn't just still. He was impossibly still. No breathing movements. No shifting to get comfortable. No checking mirrors. His face remained hidden beneath that heavy hood, but his hands on the wheel looked wrong somehow. The skin had a grayish tint, and the fingers seemed too stiff, like they had been frozen in place. I recorded everything, my heart pounding as I watched him sit there for exactly 10 minutes. Then, right on schedule, the reverse lights came on. But this time, instead of backing straight out, the truck turned slightly, and for just a second the driver's side faced directly toward the camera. The hood fell back just enough for me to see his face, and what I saw sent me stumbling backward into the cigarette display. The features were human but wrong. Sunken eyes that didn't reflect any light. Skin that looked like old leather. An expression of complete emptiness. No recognition, no emotion, nothing that suggested a living person sat behind that wheel. The truck vanished into the night before I could recover. I spent the next hour replaying the footage, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood what I had seen. But each viewing only confirmed what I saw. Whoever or whatever sat in that truck wasn't right. I saved multiple copies of the recording and started digging through the station's old log books going back months, then years. Eugene kept detailed records in a storage closet behind the break room. Dusty binders filled with delivery schedules, maintenance reports, and incident logs dating back to when the station opened in 1987. That's when I found the first mention. December 1993, a note about a customer complaint regarding an abandoned vehicle at Pump 4 during the 2 a.m. hour. The description matched perfectly. Blue Chevy pickup, lone male driver never exits the vehicle. The entries appeared here and there after that. Always on Wednesdays, always during winter storms, always at exactly 2 a.m. The real shock came when I found a folder labeled Incident Reports Law Enforcement, tucked behind the older logs. Inside were photocopied police reports, missing person flyers, and newspaper clippings. One caught my attention immediately. An article from January 1992 about a local man named Walter Hayes who disappeared during a severe blizzard. He had been driving home from his job at a mining camp when his truck, a blue 1988 Chevy Silverado, vanished somewhere along the Dalton Highway. Search parties found no trace of him or the vehicle despite extensive efforts. The article included a photo of Walter, and even in the grainy newspaper copy I recognized those sunken features. But it was the last document in the folder that made me drop everything and reach for my phone. Someone had run the truck's license plate 2 years ago and attached the results. The plate belonged to Walter Hayes, and according to DMV records it had been registered to a vehicle declared missing in January 1992. Over 30 years ago. I tried calling Eugene, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The next Wednesday was just 2 days away, and I couldn't decide whether to quit immediately or stay to face whatever kept returning to Pump 4. Curiosity won along with a strange sense of duty. Like I needed to understand this for Walter's sake, wherever he really was. I spent those 2 days researching everything I could find about the disappearance. Walter had been 28 when he vanished. He worked rotating shifts at the Red Dog mine and left behind a wife and baby daughter. The search efforts had been hampered by the blizzard that night, with visibility near zero and temperatures dropping to 40 below. One detail from the police report stood out. Walter's last radio contact with the mining camp mentioned stopping for gas, though he never said where. The timeline would have put him near mile 237 around 2 a.m. right when the storm hit its worst. I also discovered something else in the newspaper files. 3 other people had gone missing along that stretch of highway over the years. All during winter storms, all late at night. None of them were ever found. Wednesday arrived with clear skies for once. Stars visible through the station windows and the temperature around -20. I had convinced myself that maybe the clear weather would break the pattern. That whatever brought Walter's truck back only came with storms. But at 1:45 a.m. clouds rolled in from nowhere bringing snow that fell in thick heavy sheets. By 1:55 visibility had dropped to almost nothing. And I knew he would come. I had prepared everything. Fresh batteries in my flashlight, my phone fully charged, Eugene's number on speed dial, and a baseball bat from the storage room tucked behind the counter. At exactly 2 a.m. those familiar headlights pierced through the snow. The blue Chevy rolled up to pump 4 with that same mechanical precision. Walter, or the thing that used to be Walter, sat behind the wheel in his eternal watch. This time I didn't wait. I grabbed the flashlight and bat, took a deep breath, and pushed out into the storm. The cold hit like a physical force, stealing my breath and making my eyes water instantly. Snow swirled in crazy patterns, reducing the world to a white void broken only by the dim glow of the station lights and the idling truck. As I got closer to pump 4, fighting against the wind with every step, I noticed something that hadn't been visible on the cameras. The snow around the truck fell differently, creating a perfect circle where not a single flake touched the vehicle. Even stranger, the windows showed no fog from breathing, no moisture from body heat. The inside looked as cold as the air outside. I reached the driver's side door, my flashlight beam catching that terrible face in profile. Up close, Walter's features were even more disturbing. Skin like old paper stretched over bone. Eyes that were open but saw nothing. Lips slightly parted as if frozen mid-word. I raised my hand to knock on the window, and that's when everything went wrong. The moment my knuckles touched the glass, the station's power cut out completely. The pumps went dark. The building behind me vanished into blackness, and even my flashlight died. In that sudden darkness, I heard the truck's door open for the first time. The emergency generator should have kicked in within seconds, but the darkness stretched on. I stumbled backward, swinging the bat blindly while trying to restart my flashlight with numb fingers. Then impossibly I saw light coming from inside the station. Not the harsh fluorescent lights, but a soft pale glow coming from the windows. Through the snow I could make out a figure standing inside, perfectly still, facing outward. The shape was wrong. Too tall and too thin. But I recognized the heavy winter coat and the hollow face. Walter stood inside the locked station on the wrong side of the front window, staring out at me. Frost spread across the glass from where he stood, forming complex patterns that crept outward like frozen veins. The really horrifying part was that I could still hear the truck idling behind me, engine running smooth and steady. I turned my head just enough to confirm what I already knew. The driver's seat was empty, the door hanging open. When I looked back at the station, Walter had moved closer to the glass. Close enough that I could see every detail of his ruined face. Those empty eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my chest tight with panic. The sound that came next will haunt me forever. A voice like wind through a frozen pipe, muffled by the glass but clear enough to understand. Still looking for pump 4. Each word came out slow and labored, with more frost spreading across the window until the entire front was white with ice. I backed away, slipping on the snow-covered ground. The bat useless in my shaking hands. Behind me the truck's engine suddenly revved, headlights flashing in a rhythm that seemed almost like code. The pale glow inside the station began to pulse in sync with the lights. I realized with growing horror that Walter wasn't alone in there. Shadows moved behind him. Other figures in winter gear, all standing at the windows now. 4 of them total, including Walter, matching the number of missing persons I had read about. They all stared out with those same empty eyes, mouths moving together to form words I couldn't hear over the storm. The frost on the windows began forming letters spelled out in ice. "Help us find the way." I ran. Not back to the truck, not to the highway, but around the building to the employee entrance, fumbling with my keys while those dead eyes tracked my movement through every window. The door finally opened and I burst inside, slamming it behind me and throwing the deadbolt. The emergency lights suddenly blazed to life, revealing an empty store. No figures at the windows, no frost on the glass, everything normal except for the thundering of my own heartbeat. But the truck was still out there. I could hear it idling at pump 4. I called 911 with trembling fingers, babbling about intruders and power outages, anything to get someone else there. While waiting, I grabbed the USB drive with the footage and stuffed it in my pocket. Then I noticed something that made me sick. The clock on the wall showed 2:47 a.m., but according to my phone only 10 minutes had passed since the power went out. The responding officer found nothing. No truck, no footprints except mine. No frost damage to the windows. The next morning I gave Eugene my resignation, packed my things and left Alaska entirely. But sometimes on winter nights when the snow falls heavy I still dream about Pump 4 and those words traced in ice. I never found out what they were looking for. And honestly, I hope I never do. Story 3: The Hunt. October 2019 was when everything changed between me and my dad. We had planned this moose hunt up in Alaska's Copper River Basin for months. Our first real father-son trip since I had moved to Portland for work 3 years earlier. I'm 28 and work in consulting. I honestly hadn't spent more than a weekend with the old man since college. He had been hunting that region for over 2 decades. He knew every ridge and creek like his own backyard. We drove up from Anchorage in his trusty Chevy Silverado. Rifles secured, camping gear packed tight. Both of us genuinely excited about disconnecting from the world for 5 straight days. The plan seemed simple. Track some moose, maybe get lucky with a clean shot, and just enjoy the wilderness without cell towers or work emails buzzing in our pockets. The first day went exactly as we hoped. We hiked roughly 6 miles from our parking spot and found a good campsite near this narrow creek that cut through a valley surrounded by dense spruce and birch trees. Dad had that confident swagger he always got in the woods. He pointed out animal signs, explained wind patterns, and shared stories about previous hunts in the area. The weather was crisp but not brutal. Maybe 35 degrees with clear skies and that perfect autumn light filtering through the trees. We set up our tent, organized our gear, and spent the evening planning our route for the next morning, while sharing a thermos of coffee spiked with whiskey. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. We were both tired from the hike, talking quietly about family stuff, work stress, and life in general. Neither of us had any idea that we were already being watched. The weirdness started on day 2. We had been hiking for about 3 hours following this game trail that wound up through a series of rocky outcrops when Dad stopped dead in his tracks. He was staring at something about 30 yards ahead, his expression shifting from casual interest to genuine confusion. When I caught up to him, I saw what had grabbed his attention. Scattered pieces of what used to be a caribou, but not like any kill I had ever seen before. The bones were picked completely clean, almost surgically precise. But the strange part was how the pieces were arranged. They weren't just randomly scattered like a normal predator kill would be. Instead, they formed this weird pattern, almost like they had been deliberately placed in a rough circle around a flat boulder. The skull sat right in the center, empty sockets, staring up at the gray sky. The larger bones spread outward like spokes on a wheel. Dad knelt down next to the remains, running his fingers along the clean bone edges. He had been hunting for over 20 years. He had seen plenty of bear kills, wolf packs feeding, even mountain lion attacks. But this was different. The bones were too clean, too organized, and there wasn't a single track anywhere in the soft earth around the site. Not even a partial paw print or scuff mark. "Kevin," he said quietly, using my full name, which he only did when he was seriously concerned. "I've never seen anything like this. Whatever did this is big enough to take down a full-grown caribou, but smart enough to not leave any evidence behind." We spent another 10 minutes examining the area, circling wider and wider, but found absolutely nothing. No fur, no blood trail, no disturbance in the surrounding plants. It was like the animal had just appeared, arranged these bones with surgical precision, then vanished into thin air. We tried to shake it off and continued our hunt, but the discovery had clearly rattled both of us. Dad kept glancing back toward the bone site, and I caught myself scanning the tree line more frequently than usual. About 2 miles further up the trail we found another kill. This time a ptarmigan, but again the remains were arranged in that same unnatural pattern. The small bones formed a perfect miniature circle around a smooth river stone with the tiny skull positioned exactly in the center. What made it even more disturbing was that ptarmigan are ground birds, easy prey for foxes or hawks, but there were no feathers scattered around. No signs of a struggle, nothing that would indicate a normal predator-prey encounter. Dad picked up one of the delicate wing bones and held it up to the light, showing me how cleanly it had been stripped of meat. "This is surgical work," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "No animal does this kind of precision cleaning naturally." The pattern continued throughout the day. We found 5 more kill sites, each one more unsettling than the last. A ground squirrel arranged around a piece of quartz. A marten's bones forming a perfect circle around a flat piece of shale. Each site was perfect, sterile, almost with that same eerie precision that made the hair on my arms stand up. What really got to me was the escalation. The kills were getting fresher as we moved deeper into the basin. The first caribou had been there for days, maybe weeks, but the last few sites still had that metallic smell of recent death clinging to them. Dad started walking differently, keeping his rifle ready, constantly checking behind us. Neither of us wanted to admit it out loud, but we both knew something was tracking our movements, staying just far enough ahead to prepare these grotesque displays for us to find. It was like we were being led deeper into its territory, following a trail of increasingly fresh kills that served as both warning and invitation. That night we made camp in a small clearing surrounded by thick spruce trees, both of us too on edge to venture further. Dad insisted we keep the fire burning all night, taking turns on watch, even though we had never done that on previous camping trips. I drew the first shift sitting with my back against a fallen log, rifle across my lap, listening to every snap of branches and rustle of leaves in the darkness beyond our firelight. Around 2 a.m. during Dad's watch, I woke up to the sound of him whispering my name urgently. When I opened my eyes, he was pointing toward the opposite side of the clearing, his face pale in the flickering orange glow. "There," he breathed. "Between those 2 big spruces. Don't move too fast, but tell me what you see." I turned my head slowly, following his gaze, and that's when I saw them. 2 enormous yellow eyes reflecting our firelight, positioned about 8 feet off the ground, completely motionless. They weren't the typical green eye shine you would expect from a deer or moose, but this intense, almost golden color that seemed to pulse with intelligence. The eyes watched us for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. They never blinked, never moved, just maintained that steady, calculating stare that made my skin crawl. Dad had his rifle trained on the spot, but neither of us could make out any body shape or outline in the darkness behind those eyes. Whatever was watching us was massive. The eye placement alone suggested something significantly larger than any wolf or bear I had ever encountered. The strangest part was how absolutely silent it was. No breathing sounds, no movement of plants, no shifting of weight from one foot to another. Just those unblinking eyes studying us with what felt like predatory patience. When dawn finally started to break, and the first gray light began filtering through the trees, the eyes simply vanished. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, as if they had never existed at all. We searched the area thoroughly once we had enough light, but found no tracks, no disturbed plants, no physical evidence that anything had been there. Day 3 changed everything. We had been hiking for about 4 hours, both of us jumpy and exhausted from the sleepless night, when we reached the ridge line overlooking the main valley. Dad was using his binoculars to scan for moose sign when he suddenly went completely rigid. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, handing me the binoculars with shaking fingers. "Tell me I'm not losing my mind." I adjusted the focus and looked where he was pointing, and there it was. Standing on the opposite ridge, maybe 800 yards away, was the largest wolf I had ever seen. But calling it a wolf doesn't really do it justice. This thing was enormous, easily the size of a small horse, with a massive head and shoulders that seemed too broad for any normal dog. Its fur was almost black except for these weird silver markings along its spine that caught the sunlight like metal. What made my heart race was the way it was standing. Completely still, facing directly toward us, like it had been waiting for us to reach that exact spot. The wolf stood there for maybe 2 minutes, just watching us through what must have been its own incredible vision. Even at that distance I could feel the weight of its attention, like it was cataloging every detail of our appearance and behavior. Dad was fumbling with his rifle trying to get a clear shot, but the range was too far for any reliable accuracy. Then, without any warning or gradual movement, the wolf turned and began walking along the ridge line with this fluid, almost flowing movement that didn't look natural. It moved like liquid shadow, covering ground impossibly fast while maintaining perfect balance on terrain that would challenge even an experienced mountain climber. What terrified me most was how it would stop every 100 yards or so, turn back toward us, and wait just long enough for us to track its movement before continuing. It was clearly demonstrating that it could outmaneuver us effortlessly. That it had been controlling this entire encounter from the beginning. That's when everything clicked into place for me. The bone arrangements, the fresh kills getting progressively newer as we moved deeper into the basin, the silent nighttime surveillance, and now this calculated display of dominance. We weren't hunting in its territory. We were being hunted by it. This wasn't some random predator protecting its domain. This was something far more intelligent and deliberate. The wolf had been shadowing us for the entire trip, staying just close enough to monitor our movements, while leaving those grotesque calling cards to announce its presence. Dad must have reached the same conclusion, because he grabbed my arm and said, "We're leaving right now. This thing has been playing with us." We packed up our gear with frantic efficiency, abandoning any pretense of continuing the hunt. As we started our descent back toward the valley, I couldn't resist one last look through the binoculars. The wolf was still there, sitting now like some ancient guardian, watching our retreat with what I swear looked like satisfaction. The hike back to our truck took us 6 hours of non-stop walking. Both of us constantly checking the ridge lines and tree lines around us. We didn't speak much during the descent, but I could tell Dad was processing the same unsettling realization that was eating at me. That massive wolf had been orchestrating our entire experience from day one. Every kill site, every strange arrangement of bones, every moment of growing unease had been carefully planned to guide us deeper into its domain until it was ready to reveal itself. When we finally reached the Silverado, Dad threw our gear into the bed with shaking hands and started the engine before I had even closed my door. As we drove away, I watched the wilderness disappear in the side mirror, and I swear I could still feel those golden eyes tracking our movement. We never went back to that area, and Dad sold his hunting gear the following spring. Neither of us ever talked about what we had experienced, but I know we both understood that we had encountered something that shouldn't exist. An apex predator with intelligence that bordered on supernatural. And we had been incredibly lucky to leave its territory alive. Story 4. The Research Project. The Caribou Migration Project seemed like the perfect opportunity to advance my career as a wildlife biologist. After 6 years of smaller research assignments, I finally had the chance to lead a team studying how climate change was disrupting traditional migration routes near the Yukon River. The assignment came through in late April 2017, and within 2 weeks I was heading into the Canadian wilderness with a 5-person research team. We were tasked with monitoring 43 GPS-collared caribou over 3 weeks, documenting their movements and behavior patterns. The data we collected would potentially influence conservation policies across the region, making this one of the most important projects I had ever been involved in. I remember feeling this mixture of excitement and responsibility as we loaded our gear. Thermal drones, tracking equipment, camping supplies for an extended stay in some seriously remote territory. Our base camp was established at an old logging site that had been abandoned sometime in the 1980s. The location was ideal for our research purposes. Flat ground for equipment, set up close proximity to the river for water access, and positioned directly along one of the main caribou migration corridors. But the place had this unsettling atmosphere that I couldn't quite shake. Rusted machinery sat half buried under decades of moss and fallen leaves, while rotting wooden structures slowly surrendered to the encroaching forest. My team consisted of Dr. Robert Martinez, our experienced project leader, Sarah Kim from the university's wildlife department, and 2 graduate students named Ben and Carol. We had collaborated on previous assignments, so there was an established workflow to how we organized our campsite, distributed daily responsibilities, and settled into our research routine. The first few days proceeded exactly according to plan, with clear, consistent GPS signals streaming in from all tagged animals. The work itself was methodical and rewarding. Every morning we would check our tracking systems while drinking coffee around the portable camp stove, watching dozens of red dots move across our digital maps. The caribou were following their expected routes, clustering in feeding areas during the day and moving steadily northward each night. Sarah handled the thermal drone flights, capturing behavioral footage that would complement our GPS data. Ben and Carol took turns monitoring the radio frequencies while Dr. Martinez and I analyzed movement patterns and updated our field notes. The weather held steady. Cool mornings, warm afternoons, and crystal clear nights. Perfect for equipment operation. By day 5 we documented some fascinating deviations from historical migration patterns. Exactly the kind of data that would make our research valuable. The routine was comfortable, predictable, and everything was going according to our carefully planned schedule. During those first several days I started noticing small details about the abandoned logging site that hadn't been immediately apparent. There were these perfectly straight-cut marks on certain trees, far too precise to be natural, suggesting the loggers had used some kind of advanced equipment for their time. The concrete foundations of demolished buildings formed geometric patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like whoever had designed the original layout had some specific organizational system in mind. Most intriguingly, we found several metal plates buried under decades of debris. Each one stamped with sequential numbers, but no company identification or dates. Dr. Martinez mentioned that logging operations from that era typically left more obvious traces. Marked trees, equipment, serial numbers, proper signage. But this place was different, almost sterile in how thoroughly it had been cleared of identifying information. Still, it didn't interfere with our research, and we had more pressing concerns than investigating the site's mysterious past. Everything changed on the night of May 15th. I was reviewing data logs in my tent around 11:30 p.m. when Ben came running from the monitoring station, his face pale in the lantern light. "Sarah, you need to see this right now," he said, his voice tight with concern. All 43 GPS signals had disappeared simultaneously at exactly 11:17 p.m. Not gradually, not one by one, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The tracking system showed no error messages, no equipment malfunctions, no technical explanations for the sudden blackout. Carol ran diagnostics on our receivers while Dr. Martinez checked the backup systems, but everything on our end was functioning perfectly. We spent the next 3 hours trying to re-establish contact, adjusting frequencies, boosting signal strength, even attempting manual pings to individual callers. Nothing worked. The caribou had simply vanished from our monitoring network, leaving us staring at empty screens and wondering what the hell had just happened. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in the wilderness. Usually the Canadian forest at night is alive with sounds. Owls calling branches, creaking, small animals rustling through undergrowth. But after the signals disappeared, even those familiar noises seemed to fade away, replaced by an oppressive quiet that made my ears ring. We decided to take shifts monitoring the equipment through the night, hoping the signals might return as mysteriously as they had vanished. Dr. Martinez took the first watch, followed by Carol, then Ben. When my turn came at 4 a.m., I sat alone in the monitoring tent, surrounded by silent equipment, and trying to make sense of what had happened. The GPS system had never failed so completely before, and the timing. All signals cutting out at the exact same moment suggested something far more serious than a simple technical glitch. I kept checking and rechecking our data logs, hoping to find some pattern or explanation that we had missed. Dawn brought no relief, just more questions. We packed up quickly and headed out to the last known location of the nearest caribou herd, about 6 miles northeast of our camp. The hike through dense forest was tense. Everyone lost in their own thoughts about what we might find. When we reached the area, there was no sign of the animals. No tracks, no droppings, no evidence they had ever been there. But our equipment was undisturbed, sitting exactly where we had left it the previous day. Cameras, motion sensors, even the backup GPS units were all functioning normally, still recording data from their positions. It was as if the caribou had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the technology we had used to monitor them. Carol suggested we expand our search radius, but Dr. Martinez was already looking worried about our timeline and resources. We spent the entire day searching a 12-mile area, finding nothing but empty wilderness, and the growing certainty that something unprecedented had occurred. That evening, Carol decided to review the thermal drone footage from the previous night, hoping to find some clue about what had happened to the caribou. We gathered around her laptop in the main tent, watching hours of grainy infrared video. Most of it showed exactly what we expected. Empty forest, occasional small animals moving through the underbrush, the normal thermal signatures of a quiet wilderness night. But at 11:15 p.m., just 2 minutes before the GPS signals disappeared, the footage captured something extraordinary. 7 tall figures emerged from the tree line, moving in perfect synchronization across the open area near our camp. They were definitely humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too coordinated, moving with a fluid precision that seemed almost mechanical. The thermal signatures showed they were warmer than the surrounding environment, but cooler than normal human body temperature. Most disturbing was how they moved together like a single organism, with multiple parts maintaining exact spacing and identical movements as they crossed the frame and disappeared back into the forest on the opposite side. None of us spoke for several minutes after the footage ended. Dr. Martinez rewound it 3 times, studying every detail, while Ben kept muttering that the equipment must have malfunctioned. But Carol and I both knew what we were seeing was real. The thermal imaging was too consistent, too detailed to be some kind of technical glitch. The figures were approximately 8 feet tall, with elongated limbs and movements that suggested they were intimately familiar with the terrain. They made no sound that the drone's audio equipment could detect, moving across fallen logs and dense undergrowth without disturbing a single branch. What haunted me most was their coordination. Not just walking in formation, but actually mirroring each other's movements down to the smallest gesture. When the lead figure raised what appeared to be its arm, all 7 performed the identical motions simultaneously. We watched the clip dozens of times, but it only raised more questions about what we were dealing with, and whether it was connected to the caribou disappearance. That night we implemented a buddy system. No one was allowed to leave their tent alone, and we established regular check-ins every hour until dawn. Despite our precautions, I'd barely slept, listening to every sound outside and wondering if those figures were still out there watching us. Around 3 a.m. I heard Carol whispering urgently to Ben in the tent next to mine. But when I called out to ask if everything was okay, she said she had just had a bad dream. The rest of the night passed without incident, but morning brought a new horror that made the previous day's mysteries seem trivial. When we gathered for breakfast at 7 a.m., Ben was missing. His sleeping bag was empty, his personal belongings still neatly arranged beside his cot, and his boots were gone. We searched the immediate area around camp, calling his name and checking all the places he might have wandered during the night. Dr. Martinez was already talking about contacting emergency services when I decided to check the riverbank, thinking maybe Ben had gone for water and slipped on the muddy slope. What I found at the water's edge defied every logical explanation I could think of. Ben's hiking boots were placed with mathematical precision on a flat rock positioned perfectly parallel to each other and facing directly toward the flowing water. The laces were tied in neat bows exactly as he always wore them, and there wasn't a single scuff mark or piece of mud on the leather. But there were no footprints. Not leading to the boots, not leading away from them, nothing in the soft riverbank soil that would indicate how they had gotten there. The rock they sat on was completely dry despite the morning mist that had dampened everything else in the area. I called the others over and we spent 2 hours examining every inch of the surrounding ground, looking for any trace of Ben's passage. The absence of tracks was absolute and impossible. Even if someone had deliberately erased footprints, there would be signs of the erasure itself. Yet the boots sat there like a carefully arranged display, as if they had been placed by someone who could move without touching the ground. We packed up camp immediately and hiked back to the nearest communication point to contact the authorities. The search and rescue operation lasted 4 days, involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and experienced wilderness teams, but no trace of Ben was ever found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, with the working theory being that he had somehow fallen into the river and been swept away by the current. But that explanation didn't account for the boots, which the investigators dismissed as irrelevant details. 6 months later, I received a call from a forestry worker who had been conducting surveys in the same area. He had found something buried under a pile of stones near the old logging site. A GPS collar still functional with data showing it had been stationary in that exact location since May 15th at 11:17 p.m. It was one of the collars from our missing caribou, and the timing matched perfectly with when all the signals had disappeared. I never went back to that site, and I have never worked another research project in that region. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 5: Copper Creek Lodge. Every time someone mentions Alaska, my stomach twists into knots. People always picture the beautiful wilderness and amazing northern lights, but all I can think about is that night at Copper Creek Lodge. At the time, I was fresh out of my junior year at college, taking a seasonal job as a front desk clerk and maintenance helper at this tiny remote lodge near Wrangell St. Elias National Park. It was June 2022, and the place was basically my entire world for 3 months. The lodge had 12 small cabins scattered around the property, connected by gravel paths that crunched under your feet no matter how quietly you tried to walk. Our nearest neighbor was 40 miles away, and cell service was absolutely non-existent. The only connection to the outside world was a single landline in the main office that crackled with static on good days. Most nights the silence was so complete it felt like we were the only people left on Earth. The guests that week were mostly hikers and photographers, the kind of people who came to Alaska specifically to get away from civilization. There was this couple, Rachel and Mark, who had been staying in cabin 7 for 3 days with their friend Derek. Mark was one of those guys who never seemed to stop talking, always cracking jokes and making everyone laugh during meals in the main lodge. Rachel was quieter, more reserved, but she had this way of watching everything around her like she was constantly taking mental notes. Derek was somewhere in between, friendly enough but kept to himself most of the time. They would spend their days hiking the trails around the property, and come back every evening completely exhausted, covered in mud and mosquito bites. The dynamic between them seemed normal enough, just 3 friends on a wilderness adventure, but there was this underlying tension I couldn't quite put my finger on, especially between Mark and Derek. The day everything went wrong started like any other. I had spent most of it fixing a broken water heater in cabin 3 and restocking supplies in the main lodge. The weather had been unusually warm for June, and by evening the air was thick with mosquitoes and that strange twilight that never quite turns to full darkness during Alaskan summers. Around 9 p.m. I noticed Mark, Rachel, and Derek heading toward the bathhouse, which was this small wooden building about 100 yards from the main lodge. Derek was carrying a towel and seemed eager to finally get cleaned up after their long hike. Mark and Rachel were walking behind him, and I could hear Mark's voice getting louder as they got farther away, though I couldn't make out what he was saying. There was something about his tone that made me pause while I was locking up the office, but I shrugged it off. Guests argued sometimes, especially when they were tired and dealing with the isolation. About an hour later I was in my small staff cabin reading when I heard voices outside. At first I thought it was just other guests coming back from evening activities, but the voices were getting closer and more agitated. Then I heard Rachel's voice, sharp and panicked, calling out something about Derek being missing. I put down my book and listened more carefully. Mark was with her, and they were moving from cabin to cabin, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen Derek. Their voices had this frantic edge that made the hair on my arms stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. That's when Rachel spotted me. She came running over, her face pale even in the dim light. Mark was right behind her with this wild look in his eyes that I had never seen before. Rachel kept saying Derek had disappeared after some kind of fight near the bathhouse. But when I asked for details, both of them seemed to stumble over their words. The story they told me kept changing every time I asked a question. First, Rachel said Derek had gotten into an argument with a stranger who was lurking around the bathhouse. Then Mark jumped in and said the stranger had been there for hours just watching people come and go. But when I asked what this stranger looked like, Rachel described a tall man with dark hair, while Mark insisted he was shorter with a beard. Their descriptions were so different it was like they were talking about completely different people. Rachel kept wringing her hands and looking around nervously, while Mark was pacing back and forth, running his fingers through his hair repeatedly. The whole situation felt wrong, like they were performing some kind of rehearsed panic rather than genuinely worried about their friend. I told them we should check the bathhouse first, and maybe Derek had just wandered off to cool down after whatever argument had happened. But as we walked toward the building, I noticed Mark kept glancing at Rachel with these quick, meaningful looks that made my skin crawl. The bathhouse was completely empty when we got there, but there were clear signs of some kind of struggle. The wooden bench outside was overturned and there were scuff marks in the dirt that looked like someone had been dragged or had fallen hard. Rachel immediately started crying and saying they needed to call the police. But when I suggested we use the landline in the main office, Mark quickly said we should search the property first. He insisted that Derek probably just went for a walk to clear his head and would be back any minute. But the way he said it with this forced calm in his voice made me realize he was trying to control the situation. I agreed to help them search, but I was already planning to call the authorities as soon as we got back to the lodge. The three of us spent the next hour combing through the trails with flashlights, calling Derek's name, and getting no response. Every shadow seemed threatening and every sound made us jump. Rachel kept asking what we were going to do, but Mark kept steering the conversation away from calling for help. When we finally gave up the search around midnight, I was exhausted and genuinely worried about Derek. I told Mark and Rachel that I was going to call the state troopers from the main office. That's when Mark's whole demeanor changed. He grabbed my arm and said we should wait until morning, that Derek would probably show up on his own, and we would just be wasting everyone's time. But Rachel disagreed, saying they needed to call Derek's family and let them know what was happening. The two of them started arguing right there in front of me, and I could hear the desperation in both their voices. Mark kept insisting that calling the police would just make things worse, while Rachel was practically begging him to let me make the call. During their argument, I noticed Mark had scratches on his forearms that definitely weren't there earlier in the day. When I asked him about them, he claimed he had gotten them while pushing through some bushes during our search. But the scratches looked fresh and deep, like fingernail marks, and they were in a pattern that made me think of someone trying to defend themselves. I finally convinced them that we needed to contact the authorities, and the three of us walked back to the main lodge together. The building felt eerily quiet as I unlocked the office door, and I could hear both Mark and Rachel breathing heavily behind me. When I picked up the landline phone to dial, there was no dial tone, just complete silence. I jiggled the cord and checked all the connections, but the line was completely dead. Mark immediately said the phone lines probably went down because of the weather, but there hadn't been any storms that day. Rachel was getting more agitated by the minute, pacing around the small office and muttering about how they needed to get help somehow. I told them I would drive to the nearest town in the morning to report Derek missing, but Mark quickly volunteered to go instead. He said he knew the area better and could get there faster, but something about his eagerness to leave made me suspicious. I insisted that we all stay together until we figured out what had happened to Derek. That's when I noticed Mark and Rachel exchange another one of those loaded glances. We decided to wait until dawn before making any decisions, and I offered to let them stay in the main lodge instead of going back to their cabin. Rachel accepted immediately, but Mark seemed reluctant, saying he wanted to go back and get some of their things. I watched him walk toward cabin 7, and something about the way he moved, quick and purposeful, made me decide to follow him at a distance. I grabbed my flashlight and snuck out the back door of the lodge, staying in the shadows as I made my way toward their cabin. Mark went inside for maybe 10 minutes. When he came out, he was carrying a large duffel bag that looked much heavier than it should have if he was just getting clothes. He also had something wrapped in a towel tucked under his arm, and he kept looking around nervously as he walked back. I managed to get back to the lodge before him, but I pretended to be dozing in one of the lobby chairs when he returned. Rachel was curled up on the couch, but I could tell she wasn't really sleeping either. The three of us spent the rest of the night in that main room, and I don't think any of us got a minute of real sleep. When the sun finally came up around 4:30 a.m., I suggested we all walk back to the bathhouse area in the daylight to see if we could find any more clues about what happened to Derek. Mark immediately protested, saying we had already searched thoroughly and wouldn't find anything new, but Rachel stood up and said she wanted to look again. After a moment of hesitation, Mark agreed to come with us. As we walked toward the bathhouse, I noticed Mark kept positioning himself between Rachel and me, like he was trying to control what we could see or where we could go. The morning light revealed details we had missed in the dark. There were drops of what looked like dried blood on the wooden steps of the bathhouse, and the ground around the building was more disturbed than I had initially realized. Rachel pointed out a torn piece of fabric caught on a nearby bush. When she started to reach for it, Mark quickly stepped in and said, "We shouldn't touch anything that might be evidence." But the way he said it with this forced authority in his voice made me wonder if he was trying to preserve evidence or destroy it. Around 7 a.m. I heard the distant sound of a helicopter approaching, which was unusual since we rarely got air traffic that early in the morning. Mark's face went completely white when he heard it, and he started talking rapidly about how they should probably head back to their cabin to pack up and leave. But Rachel was staring at the helicopter with this expression of relief mixed with terror, and she whispered something about hoping it was help. The helicopter landed in the clearing near the main lodge, and 2 state troopers got out along with a paramedic. My first thought was that someone else had called about Derek, but then I realized that was impossible since our phone lines were down. One of the troopers approached us and asked if we were the people who had reported a missing person. Before I could answer, Mark jumped in and said there had been a misunderstanding. He claimed Derek had just wandered off for a walk and had probably already made it back to town on his own. The trooper looked skeptical and asked to speak with each of us separately, starting with Rachel. While Rachel was talking to the officers, Mark kept trying to convince me that we should tell them everything was fine and that Derek would turn up eventually. He was sweating despite the cool morning air, and he kept fidgeting with something in his pocket. But then the paramedic came over and told us they had found Derek about 2 miles downstream near the old mining road. He was alive but in critical condition with multiple stab wounds, and they had already airlifted him to a hospital in Fairbanks. The paramedic said Derek had managed to crawl to the road and flagged down a passing truck driver who had called for help on his CB radio. When I looked at Mark after hearing this news, his face had gone completely gray, and he was staring at the ground like he was trying to disappear. Rachel started crying, but they weren't tears of relief. They were tears of fear. The troopers arrested Mark that afternoon after finding the knife wrapped in the towel he had retrieved from their cabin. Rachel confessed that she had helped him move Derek's body after the attack. She said Mark had snapped during an argument about money Derek owed him, and they had panicked when they thought he was dead. The phone line had been cut with wire cutters found in Mark's bag. Rachel got a reduced sentence for cooperating, but Mark was charged with attempted murder. I quit my job the next day and never went back to Alaska. Sometimes I still wake up wondering what would have happened if that truck driver hadn't found Derek in time. Story 6: The Fishing Trip. Most summers my Uncle Frank would take me out fishing somewhere remote in Alaska. He's the kind of guy who thinks Wi-Fi is a government trick and that real life starts when your boots hit mud. That particular trip we were camped just outside Bethel along a bend in the Kuskokwim River where the bank slopes down in a jagged mess of roots and packed dirt. I had just turned 13 that spring, and it was my first time getting my own gear. Rod boots, even a small fillet knife. I remember feeling proud, like I had finally earned a spot alongside the grown-ups, even if I still had to sleep in the smaller tent. It was early afternoon, and Frank had hiked up river a ways to check some traps, leaving me with instructions not to wander far and to keep the fire going. The sun was out, but hazy filtered through low clouds that made everything look softer, quieter. I had set up by the water with my tackle box and a half-warmed thermos of black coffee I wasn't really supposed to be drinking. The current was slow that day, dragging bits of moss and drift in wide arcs. I remember watching the surface like it was a movie. No phone, no distractions, just that steady hush of water and wind. Then someone called out from the trees behind me. At first I thought it was Frank messing with me. The voice had that friendly but strange tone, like someone trying not to spook a stray dog. When I turned, I saw a man standing halfway down the slope leading into the brush. He had on this camo jacket that looked like it had been dipped in mud and forgotten for years, and a wool beanie stretched over his head like he had pulled it on without checking if it fit. I didn't recognize him. He wasn't from the campgrounds or from the small shop we stopped at in town. He smiled with his mouth open just enough to show a missing canine tooth and said he was a local guide. He claimed he was moving gear for a group of hunters and needed a second pair of hands. There was something about how still he stood while talking that didn't sit right with me. His feet never shifted. His hands stayed behind his back even when he gestured with his chin toward the trees. I asked which outfitter he worked for, and he dodged the question like I had asked for his social security number. Then he laughed this dry, shallow sound and said I looked strong enough to carry a couple crates. He pointed deeper into the woods, saying it wasn't far, just past the ridge. I remembered feeling my knees tense, not with fear exactly, but like my body had already made a decision before my brain caught up. I told him I needed to grab my boots, stalling really, but he stepped forward like he hadn't heard me. Only a few feet, but it felt way too close. His boots sank into the soft dirt near the edge of the water, leaving deep, wide prints like he had been pacing that shoreline for a while. That's when I noticed the back of his pants were soaked up to the thighs, and not from walking through shallow river water. It was darker, muddier, like he had been kneeling somewhere wet for too long. He glanced toward the trail again, but there wasn't any gear in sight. Just thick brush and a mess of alder branches snapped low like someone had pushed through them fast and recently. I said no. I didn't even think about it. Just said it out loud, firm and clear, the way my uncle had told me to speak if something ever felt wrong. The man didn't respond right away. He just kept standing there staring like I hadn't spoken at all. His face didn't change, but his jaw clenched once quick. Then he sort of laughed through his nose and muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "They never learn." That's when I backed away, careful not to turn around, keeping the river behind me as a kind of barrier. I felt this weird pressure, like I had to keep talking or moving or doing something because silence felt dangerous. I walked backward until I hit a log that marked the trail back to camp. That's when he took one more step toward me, slow, deliberate, and said, "You don't want to be out here alone when it gets dark." It wasn't a threat. Not exactly. More like he was stating a fact. His tone was flat and weirdly calm, like he was reciting a weather report. I didn't answer. I just turned and ran. Didn't check if he followed. I didn't hear footsteps, but I also didn't trust the quiet. The trees seemed thicker on the way back, like they were leaning in, and I remember ducking under branches that hadn't been low before. By the time I reached the tents, I couldn't tell if I had been gone 10 minutes or an hour. Everything looked the same, but it all felt off balance, like the world had been nudged slightly sideways. I didn't see Frank anywhere, and for a second I panicked, thinking maybe that man had gotten to him too. But then I saw smoke curling up from the fire pit. He came out from behind the truck a few seconds later, holding a wrench, wiping grease off his fingers. He asked if I had caught anything. I told him no, and that we needed to pack up early. He gave me a look but didn't argue. We left that same afternoon. Frank didn't press for details until we were halfway down the gravel road back toward town. I told him what happened as straight as I could. He got real quiet, not angry, just focused, like he was already mentally reviewing maps and faces. He asked what the man looked like, what he said, and if I could point out the exact spot. I told him about the soaked pants, the missing tooth, the part where he kept his hands out of view. Frank didn't speak for a while after that. When we got to town, he made a quick stop at the ranger station, while I waited in the truck with the windows cracked and my fishing rod still in the back seat untouched. That night back at the motel, the news was on in the background while we were eating. I was barely paying attention until Frank turned the volume up. A missing persons alert had gone out. A boy named Tyler, 15, last seen just outside a different campsite not far from ours 4 days earlier. No solid leads, but the report mentioned he was last spotted talking to someone described as a man in camouflage, possibly local. The photo of the missing kid hit hard. He was taller than me, but something about his expression felt familiar. Just a regular teen trying to enjoy the outdoors, probably didn't expect his afternoon to turn sideways. I didn't sleep much that night. Kept thinking about how fast things could have gone bad if I had said yes. If I had followed, if I had hesitated even a second longer. It's not like I did anything heroic. I just listened to that part of myself that tenses up when something isn't quite right. I still think about that man's voice sometimes. How calm it was when he told me I didn't want to be alone out there. Not angry, not frustrated, just certain. Like he wasn't guessing how things would end. He already knew. We haven't gone back to that spot since. Frank said we would stick to places closer to town for a while. I never saw the man again, and as far as I know, no one was ever arrested. The other boy, Tyler, was never found. His name comes up sometimes in forums like this, and every time it does I think about saying something about reporting the interaction again. But the truth is I have already said what I know. Maybe posting here now is just a way to remind anyone reading. Trust that gut feeling even if it doesn't make sense in the moment, especially when it doesn't.